Welcome to this live continuous of our broadcast on our Facebook and YouTube streams. I'm David Knight, and joining me now is Leanne McAdoo. And our top topic of the day is what's happening in Syria. We're going to be talking to Syrian Girl. We're going to go to her right away. But Leanne, this is deja vu all over again, isn't it?
Absolutely, David. And this week is the exact reason why I have not owned a television for about 15 years now, because of just the amount of propaganda that they pump at us. And it's the same thing. Wag the dog. You know, it's like Groundhog's Day. Did we not learn anything from the babies in the incubator? Now we've got this 7-year-old
Well, you talk about
girl.
wag the dog.
Right.
Did we not learn anything from what Bill Clinton did when he would go and bomb Iraq, when there would be revelations that would be damaging to him politically? With Monica Lewinsky, the very next day after the House comes up with articles of impeachment, he goes and bombs Iraq. And so now we have these damaging revelations about Susan Rice, and this comes up right away. At the same time, they push out Bannon, who has spoken against foreign policy that's based on regime change. That's what Donald Trump ran on.
Right.
And if we go back 4 years ago, as I said, this is deja vu all over again.
Right.
This is what we have seen, and we saw it before. Let me read you 4 years ago to our very foolish leader: do not attack Syria. If you do, many very bad things will happen. And from that fight, the U.S. gets nothing. That was Donald Trump, September 2013, when this exact same scenario was created for us. Then again, he says, President, fill in the blank, do not attack Syria. There is no upside, tremendous downside. Save our powder for another more important day. Another one. The only reason the president wants to attack Syria is to save face over our very dumb red line statement. Do not attack Syria. Fix the USA. That's what we had an election for. We wanted to fix the USA, not get involved in this disastrous policy of regime change. Now we have Donald Trump agreeing with Lindsey Graham and John McCain with another setup, and that's what we want to talk to Syrian Girl about.
Right. I mean, and just a day before, where he was saying that he hadn't changed his mind on how he wanted to deal with Assad. We've got Tulsi Gabbard, who was kind of like the Democratic darling. She took this secret trip to Syria, where she actually met with Assad. She got the opportunity, and she said, you know what, I was not going to turn down the opportunity to meet with him. And she really got lambasted for that. People were so angry with her for doing that. But she said, listen, I visited Syria. I met with the people there. And our counterproductive regime change war does not serve America's interests. And it certainly isn't in the interest of the Syrian people. So now after this latest attack, she is tweeting out saying, you know, anyone who's responsible must be held accountable, whether it be Assad or ISIS or Al-Qaeda or anyone who is in that area who is going to have access to chemical weapons. So she's not necessarily changing her tune from what she brought back from that initial visit, but she is also saying, you know, she's not making it as an abrupt of a flip-flop. So
Did we not learn anything 4 years ago? As we did this full investigation, everybody immediately jumped 4 years ago and said it's Assad's government that's doing this. It's the only way that this could have happened.
no investigation.
And yet we had gas attacks before in the area that they had found had been done by rebels. There was an investigation that was eventually done, and we had not only the UN and Russia, but also U.S. investigators who said this is not, there's no proof that this was done by the Syrian government. So we had this discussion before, and the thing that concerns me, and as we're talking about essentially the civil war that's going on in the White House, which they say is not happening, but we can see the signs of this. We know that there are different advisor groups there. This really does have consequences. They had to get rid of General Flynn, who had explained to everybody, who understood that we had created armed and trained ISIS, that we were funding them for regime change. We've seen this happen, the disasters that have happened in Libya, creating more problems than they've solving absolutely nothing. But let's go to Syrian Girl now. Syrian Girl, tell us what from your perspective, what you're seeing there with this false narrative.
Last time in 2013, I actually told Alex Jones that this false flag attack would result not in an invasion of Syria, but basically disarmament. This was before Putin even said anything about disarmament. And the reason I know that is because I know that the US would never invade a nation that they know possesses chemical weapons or any sort of weapon of mass destruction. And they had to remove those weapons in order to enter the Syrian sphere. And that is exactly what I said would happen, that a few years down the line, they would come back and claim that Syria didn't, in fact, get rid of its chemical weapons, and they would use it as a casus belli to invade. And we've seen that happen with Iraq. It's exactly the same thing. In 1991, Iraq got rid of its chemical weapons. In 2003, in spite of the OPCW saying that Iraq no longer has chemical weapons, the Iraq war still happened. And we end up with ISIS. We end up with terrorism around the world. We end up with chaos, and we end up on the brink of World War III.
Well, that's the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. This is an organization that is tasked by the Security Council of the UN to go around and examine whether or not these people had these weapons. And as this happened, the response from the Russian spokesman, Zakharova, said it is crucial to call upon an OPCW fact-finding mission in charge of investigating the use of chemical weapons in Syria to collect evidence of the incident after the following condition. Composition of the fact-finding mission will be submitted to the UN Security Council for approval. It will be balanced in terms of geographical representation. So if we're going to go to war, if we're going to set the area on fire, if we're going to escalate this, can't we at least have a reasonable investigation and hope that there are going to be people from both sides taking a look at this and presenting forensic evidence before we just run off half-cocked and start shooting the world up?
Well, wait a minute, David. Turkey has done 3 autopsies on some of the victims, and they say sarin gas was used by Assad. So I'm sure Turkey is completely non-biased here, and they went in and they did autopsies here on 3 of the people killed. So let's just go ahead and take Erdogan. I'm sure these were not the chemical weapons that passed through Turkey via Saudi Arabia.
Do you want to comment on that, Syrian girl? I mean, the responses that I've seen from that is that if it's weaponized, that they would need to have full hazmat materials, or they would die from that if it's fully weaponized, as you would expect a state to be using. So,
I completely agree with you. If it was sarin, it would have been homemade. Everyone has seen the photos and the videos of the white helmets using their bare hands. Sarin can be absorbed through the skin, and it will kill you. Weaponized sarin will kill thousands. The Tokyo sarin attack resulted in 12 dead, but 4,000 injuries, and that was homemade sarin alone. If it was weaponized sarin, we would be looking at a completely different scenario. Obviously, it's very interesting that Turkey would come out and say that it is in fact sarin, because we've seen the narrative shift so many different times. At first they said it was sarin, then they said it was chlorine. They can't quite decide on a narrative, because if they say it's sarin, people then say, well, Syria got rid of its sarin, so how could it be Syrian sarin? So then it comes back to the fact that there's been multiple reports that the rebels have chemical weapons, that they have sarin, that Hillary Clinton brought Libya's chemical weapons to the Syrian rebels. This is a Seymour Hersh article. And in fact, the United Nations said that they suspected the attack that happened in 2013 was behind, what the rebels were behind. This was Carle Del Ponte. You can also look that up. So we have a lot of evidence that this is a false flag. In fact, more evidence than last time. Last time it was very well timed, because the OPCW had arrived in Damascus the same exact day as the chemical attack happened. And that was because they were brought to Damascus by the Syrian government to investigate a chemical attack that was conducted by the rebels in Aleppo a month earlier. And now we have also, again, perfect timing. Trump says Assad is no longer a priority. The next day, 2 days later, you get this false flag attack, and suddenly Trump is changing his tune.
That's right, because we have different advisors in place.
Exactly. And Michael Flynn, he was one of the advisors that said that he believed possibly the rebel attack in 2013 was a false flag. And maybe that's one of the reasons he was removed.
Yes.
I do want to get into 2 things. I want to get into a little bit about the evidence and a lot about the real agenda behind this and what we're going to see, if possible.
Yeah, let's talk about the false flag aspect. But before we leave the Michael Flynn thing, it's very clear that not only did they want Michael Flynn removed, but they have tried to purge people that he brought in. The CIA made it very clear. We've had a lot of media reporting, both for and against Trump, reporting that the CIA has said that these individuals that Flynn brought in were unacceptable to them. Why? Because they want to do this false flag. So let's talk about the evidence that this particular attack was a false flag?
Well, putting aside the perfect timing that this happened, where the State Department just made a statement that they no longer see removing Assad as a priority, and that the Syrian people must decide their own president. Aside from that, a lot of the reports are coming from the so-called White Helmets NGO, which is George Soros funded. It's receiving UK and US tax dollars, and they've been filmed carrying Al-Qaeda flags around, taking part in executions, hanging out with the child beheaders of the Nur al-Zinki group, one of the rebel groups that the CIA vetted and gave weapons to, which ended up beheading a child. Channel 4 News featured a video of those child beheaders hanging out with the White Helmets. I, on one of my channels, Syrian Girl War, have a video of 2 White Helmet members torturing a Syrian soldier. Like, the White Helmets, as we now know very clearly, are the same individuals that are with Al-Qaeda. They just put on a white helmet and suddenly they're no longer Al-Qaeda. And prior to this attack, a week before, in a Christian town in Hama, near Hama, there were actually 250 people that were kidnapped. So it's very clear that these rebels do not care about civilians, and they do not care about children. They behead children, so why would they care? And in the past, they've used children as tools, pawns for this political agenda.
There was a Pakistani British doctor who tweeted out that he had received gas masks, and he was holding interviews. He was taking interview requests instead of helping the people as the injuries were coming in. His name is Sajul Islam. What do you know about him?
Well, he was actually one of the people who was arrested on terrorism charges for kidnapping 2 British journalists in Syria. And while they didn't have enough evidence on him, and because the journalists couldn't testify, and he ran back away to Syria, he was actually removed from the medical board because of this incident. And another interesting thing that was happening at the time is one of these, Al-Qaeda linked journalists posted on his Facebook that tomorrow we're going to begin a campaign about chlorine gas attacks. And then this happens. So once again, the media is unsure whether it's chlorine or it's sarin. They can't settle on it. But there's been uncanny, they can't possibly be psychic, indicators that they've been pre-planning this false flag attack. And in fact, they've been receiving hazmat suits and gas masks days before the attack happened. So they must have known that they were going to use them. The thing is that with Trump, there was signs that he maybe swayed early on. He talked about safe zones. People convinced him that safe zones were going to stop refugees, basically. But safe zones were in fact just another word for no-fly zones. It's just a rehash of that, which in its entirety is the plan to balkanize Syria.
And that's what we saw 4 years ago. They were saying we need to ground Syria's air force and so forth and so on. And at the time, if you remember, when we were talking about the false flag aspects, which were identical to this at the time, we were saying we're not going to be Al-Qaeda's air force, because we knew that we had ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the White Helmets, whatever. They rebrand them as they wish. As people discover who they are, they come up with a new name. But we knew what was going on there. We had people like Flynn at the time telling us what was going on. It was eventually exposed what they had been trying to do, but they wanted us to essentially be their air force, and the purpose was regime change. And if we're concerned about the deaths that are happening there, and we should all be concerned about that. I mean, people really died. That's the issue. It's not that this is a fake incident there. People really died. They died horrific deaths. That's why chemical weapons are banned. So we're not saying that nothing happened. We're not saying that this isn't a horrible situation. What we're saying is that this policy of regime change that's been pushed by people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham is really what is responsible for this. And we need to back off of that aspect of it, and we need to understand the telltale signs, as you're pointing out, the fact that this happens immediately after some significant political events that are happening here, but also the fact that they immediately know who did this without any kind of investigation. They've already got the solution in place, just as we see when there's a mass shooting, and immediately they want to roll out their agenda of gun control. We know that that is a hallmark of a false flag operation, when they immediately start selling their agenda that has been in place. But we have seen this exact pattern 4 years ago. That is what is so distressing about this.
Mm.
And whoever planned this, perhaps they were also the ones that planned a meeting with Trump and the Jordanian king prior to the chemical attack. So the meeting happened the day after, but the planning for the meeting happened before. And Jordan is a key player, because some are saying that the US wants to, the deep state, in fact, wants to invade through Jordan and balkanize Syria and divide it in that way. And, I hear a lot of people sometimes say, well, what's the problem with balkanization? Especially in terms of the Kurdish issue. The Kurds have been receiving very, very positive media from all sides. You never hear anything bad about them. They're supposedly fighting ISIS in the north there, and they're hanging out with the US military. The real fact is, however, is that they've been ethnically cleansing the Christian population in the northeast of Syria and Iraq, because they are of the Assyrian ethnicity, and they do not want anyone in their region to be of an ethnicity other than Kurdish. The regions that they're trying to take is filled with oil and agricultural resources, but Kurds are not a majority in those areas. They only make up 40%, and so to become a majority, there's been basically continuous ethnic cleansing campaigns. They actually assassinated one and tried to assassinate a second Christian Assyrian leader, and then tried to pin it on ISIS. But because one of the people they tried to kill survived, he was able to go and tell his story and say, actually, it was the Kurds that tried to kill me. They've been disarming the Christians in Iraq and confiscating their land. Just look up the Assyrian Christians in Iraq and see the kind of things that they're saying. Basically, creating a Kurdish state is gonna expedite the end of the Christians in the Middle East, because ISIS is just, the excuse to create these separate states. It's basically an enzyme. It was always made as a target, and at the end of the day, the target is balkanization, and they can't do balkanization unless they get rid of Assad. They get a UN Security Council Resolution 7, just like Iraq was under, so that they can be legally in there to legally change the Syrian constitution, because the Syrians refuse to put anything that is religious or ethnically sectarian or racist inside our constitution. So unfortunately, the people who are in the deep state, who refuse to give up on this idea, are prepared to take us to World War III. And you see them threatening Iran, threatening North Korea, threatening Russia, threatening China in the South Sea. Maybe they know that if this is really going to happen, it's going to happen on all fronts. It's going to be a global war. And
that's what's concerning about all this is exactly a global war. And that's what's concerning, because we see people like John McCain, who seems to only get excited when the possibility of massive war and bloodshed is involved. And that's the thing that concerns me, is the fact that we now have Donald Trump, who campaigned and won on the idea that we are not going to set the world on fire with regime change. We saw what happened in Libya. Omar Gaddafi was not a great guy. He was not a good guy. Nobody is saying he was a good guy. But things are fairly stable there. We didn't have the kind of situation that we have now, which is an arms bazaar for terrorism, total chaos in the area, and we started that, and we're reaping the whirlwind after that. And they're doing the same thing. ISIS was created; it's a rebranding of Al Qaeda. People need to understand what it represents: the Islamic State in Iran and Syria. That is the goal of what we have John McCain involved in, and this is what is really concerning as I watch this. As you're talking about the fact they set up the summit with the Jordanian king and so forth, they're very cleverly isolating Donald Trump from his voters, from the people, from the agenda that he ran on and won with. That's why he needs to hear our voices. People in America need to wake up and understand that it's not just the Syrian lives that are on the line. It is our lives as well. this chaos, this death, this destruction, this enabling and equipping and training of terrorists is going to blow back on us. It already is in many places in the West. That is what is so concerning about this. I'm not talking about increasing our safety and security by continuing these regime policies. We're actually making it worse for Americans. We're not going to be safer by spreading this kind of war and chaos throughout the Middle East. It's a very complicated situation. As you were pointing out, Syrian Girl, we have different ethnic groups, we have different religious groups, we have different political groups. They're all after resources in that area. That is why the CIA is involved in this kind of divide and conquer policy.
Right.
And we need to push back against this deep state narrative that appears to be taking Donald Trump. They couldn't defeat him in the election. They couldn't defeat these ideas. But now it appears that they're going to surround him and isolate him. I always said that was the real issue that we're going to have. They were going to, if there was a massive groundswell of Americans who would push for this, push for Trump, push for this type of change, they would wait, let that happen, and then isolate the individual that was elected. And that's precisely what it appears they're successfully doing now.
Yeah. And I would like to know, what do you really want people to understand? Because, you know, here we have Representative Tulsi Gabbard making that surprise trip to Syria. And she says she spoke with Syrian people all over the country who were saying that the regime change does not, that they don't want that there. It's not in the interest of the Syrian people. They want the West to keep to themselves. But the only thing that we are being bombarded with is this 7-year-old Syrian girl and her heartbreaking plea, and she's blasted all over CNN. This is 7-year-old Syrian refugee Bana Alabad, and she was the one that was tweeting, famously, this 7-year-old tweeting from the war zone, and now she's in Turkey with her family and making this plea to Assad. And that's the only side of the Syrian people that we are given access to in the West, are the people who want to fight Assad. But people don't understand that it's a huge country. So what can you help us understand about the Syrian people and what's in their interests?
Well, you know, this poor little girl is actually exploited by her parents. Mm-hmm. Her father is a fighter. He's a terrorist. And her mother is the one making all the tweets. And one of her most famous tweets is that, you know, we need a war in Syria, even if it means World War III. And this is the humanitarian voice that we're supposed to follow. Mm-hmm. She and her family, you know, they're alive. They weren't beheaded by US-backed moderate rebels. They suddenly, you know, ended up from having the last message coming out of Aleppo and I'm injured, I'm dead, I'm alive again. Suddenly she ends up on Erdogan's lap in Turkey. You know, I have photographs, which I will release, of their entire family inside Turkey in a playground. It's claimed that this was before the war. However, Bana appears to be the same exact age as she is now and not 3 years old, which would happen before the war. So it's a ruse. Mm-hmm. And there's another one, her name is Shami, I believe, another one of these voices that were supposed to represent the Syrian people, you know, and she, in her videos, would try to, of Aleppo, try to avoid showing you all the militants with guns. The most famous one, though, is Bilal. CNN reported him all the time. He's an American in Syria, and he's supposed to be the voice of Syria. He was one of the people who had a last message for Syria. A few days ago, he ends up on the US kill list of terrorists. So CNN wants us to believe the guy who is now on the terrorist kill list. It's an atrocious thing. The Syrian people want the war to end, and they don't want terrorism. They want a secular, safe country.
Right.
That's right. They want peace. They don't want to see the kind of horrific things that we saw this last week. And that's what we need to understand. I want to focus for a second here on Turkey, because you talked about the fact that this young girl winds up on Erdogan's lap. Mm-hmm. When Seymour Hersh, who Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, exposed this a few years ago, he was talking about how rebels had smuggled in chemical weapons through Turkey. There's a Turkish connection again, with the approval of Hillary Clinton, and you mentioned that earlier. And then, of course, we now have the Turkish government saying we have looked at these bodies, and this is sarin gas, and it only could have come from the Assad regime. All of these things are bogus, they're lies. And so This is the key thing, I think, when we look at this, when we look at the people who are pushing this narrative, and it is exactly what we saw 4 years ago. We see Turkey pushing this. We see John McCain and Lindsey Graham pushing this, who are, the political arm of the CIA, if you will, in the Senate. This is the thing that I find so obvious, and yet I'm very disturbed by the fact that Donald Trump seems to have been isolated from not only his campaign, but also from the voice of voters, from the voice of reason, by the removal of Michael Flynn and others. And now with Bannon being pushed off of the National Security Council, there is no vote there to speak against this insane policy of regime change throughout the world. And it appears to be working. It appears that Donald Trump is going to follow Lindsey Graham and John McCain and goose step off into World War III. Your comments, Syrian Girl.
Well, Turkey, the entire legion of ISIS entered Syria through Turkey. They have been arming the insurgents, the Islamists, since the start. Erdogan's government is Muslim Brotherhood. A few weeks ago, the US was talking about putting the Muslim Brotherhood on the banned organizations list. Mm-hmm. They are the reason that terrorism has spread throughout the world. Trump, I don't know if he's been threatened, bribed, or brainwashed, but he is completely different to the Trump we saw in 2013, who was saying that the stupidest thing you could do is attack Syria.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a part of the US government who really doesn't want World War III, mm-hmm. and they've been pushed out. Yeah. You have now Ted Postal, who's come out again since this attack, to mention the fact that the missile shield in Israel is not going to work, the Iron Dome, that it doesn't work. And I feel that some of these individuals in power think that they can protect themselves or save themselves from a nuclear war, but that everybody else can pretty much go to hell. And that they're fine with that as long as they get full domination, full control, cut up countries as they like, and redraw maps. Doesn't matter how many people it kills, whether it's American soldiers or American people or European people or Syrian people, they don't give a crap. Mm-hmm. It's all about money, power, that's it.
And I guess the thing that is really concerning is this article we had at Infowars.com yesterday, and the title was Report, Soros-Linked Group Behind Chemical Attack in Syria. Of course, they were talking about the White Helmets, the al-Qaeda-affiliated group, and you talked about that earlier. But they conclude the article with this. They say NATO governments are unhappy with the Trump administration's recent statements that they no longer see regime change in Syria as a priority. And in response to that, British Prime Minister Theresa May made a statement that Britain was still fully committed to regime change in Syria. And so he makes that statement, and then immediately after this happens, we see a complete about turn. And I guess that's the thing that really has us all so concerned, that he not only campaigned and won on the issue that we weren't going to be fooled again by another false flag attack like we saw 4 years ago. He was not fooled by it 4 years ago. But then after he gets in office and the people who got him there get removed, and it's very clear that he's being isolated. Flynn is removed. Bannon is removed from the Security Council. And then all of a sudden, this happens just as all that is going on. The headline from Zero Hedge says it all. On the same day Bannon removed from the NSC, Trump saber rattles war with Syria. The people who surround the president really makes a difference. And that's why I was so concerned with so many of his appointments early on. Everybody said, just give him time. He wants to have all these different voices at the table. And it's like, they're going to isolate him from reality. They're going to isolate him from the public opinion that got him elected. And that's the very disturbing thing that I see, is this isolation that is happening, and the abrupt 180 that Donald Trump did this week on the basis of this attack. I don't know. Clearly, from your standpoint, you have a lot of insights as to what's going on in Turkey. And I think it's very important for Americans to understand exactly how that is being spun against us. But it's also the NATO people that are there, and it's also the different wings within the Trump White House that are now coming to bear in this political move. I want to ask you.
I wrote that article, So
Yeah,
thank you for
Yes.
reading
Like,
it.
that's
Sorry, what was
Mimi.
the question?
Okay. Yes. Excellent article. And in one of those, you were talking about these the tweets. Let's talk about this a bit. Sarah Abdallah, who said tomorrow a media campaign will begin to cover intense air raids on the Hama countryside and the use of chlorine against civilians, tipping that this is going to happen the next day.
Well, whoops.
Comment on
Sent
that.
the tweet out a little too early.
This Sarah Abdallah was tweeting a Facebook post by this individual from Orient TV. He's a journalist for Orient TV, who made that post on his Facebook the day before the chemical attack. And again, it was a campaign. So it's very interesting that he should know. It's very interesting that they receive these gas masks. And if you have a look through my article as well, you will see that some of the children actually have like blunt force trauma injuries to their heads. So I don't see how gas could cause that.
Yeah.
But it's certainly interesting. Trump is being isolated. The question is though, what are the U.S. public going to do? Because for a short time, I never believed that the U.S. had a democracy that was alive. I really believed that the deep state was completely in control. We had a Clinton and a Bush and a Clinton and a Bush. And with Trump's victory, with all of his rhetoric, we really thought that there was a chance that the world could change, that there could be some peace, and that we weren't headed for this all-out war. And now those hopes have been dashed. So the question is, what is the U.S. public going to do? Because this is all unfolding before our very eyes.
Yes.
And
we need to not put up, we have to understand that now Donald Trump, who wrote these tweets that I read at the beginning of the hour, saying, do not attack Syria. There's no upside, tremendous downside. Mr. President, you want to attack Syria to save face over a very dumb red line statement. And now he's putting out his own red line statements. He's sounding like Jeb, and he's sounding like Hillary, and he's sounding like McCain and Graham. And this is very, very troubling. And I want to say one more thing, too, when we talk about the false flag aspects of this. We've had other situations where not only did it happen at a politically significant time, not only did they have the solution, quote unquote, already lined up that coincided with their political goals, but we would have a tip-off the day before that something was happening. There would be information that would be on social media. Typically, people would push back against that and say, well, that has to do with differences in timestamps and so forth and so on. And yet, in this particular social media posting, the guy said tomorrow, and he did it the day before. So this is not some kind of a timestamp discrepancy. This is a clear prediction of what was going to happen. And we weren't just told this was going to happen a day before. We were told that this was going to happen 4 years ago because they did exactly the same thing 4 years ago. Why would Donald Trump not fall for it 4 years ago, but now appears to be falling for it today? And of course, there is still a little bit of hope because they're saying they have not decided on a course of action yet. And yet there is so much saber rattling coming from the tweets and from the administration. It sounds like they have decided that they're going to do precisely what he spoke against Barack Obama doing 4 years ago with exactly the same scenario.
Right.
It's very bizarre for Trump to suddenly say that he has, the emotional aspect of watching these videos have swayed his foreign policy when last month, apparently the US had a higher civilian deaths than Russia or Syria airstrikes. And this is from the same people, the same organizations like the Syrian HR organization that's run by a guy in a 2-bedroom apartment in Coventry that makes all of these statements. Trump is believing this source who at the same time, said that the US had killed more civilians than anyone in March. So why these civilians are more important than those civilians, it doesn't make any logical sense. And why did the 2013 civilians not affect him in the same way? Why
exactly
is he suddenly now just all emotion and no logic?
I said that last night when I started to read this news. I started out with a story about what happened in Tikrit, Iraq, the dozens of people that were killed there. And I said, oh, wait a minute, I thought this happened in Syria. And it's like, oh, yeah, these are two separate stories. You heard about the one story, but you didn't hear about the other story. You haven't heard about the bombings in Yemen and the civil war that Saudi Arabia started there and that we are supporting. You haven't heard about the attacks on hospitals in Afghanistan that went on for a very prolonged period of time that went back to Obama's military. So we have to understand this is being very selectively done. We're told that the Russians bear responsibility for this, that they need to do something about it because they are dominating Assad there. And yet, do we not bear responsibility for what is going on in Iraq? Don't we dominate Iraq in the same way that Russia dominates Syria?
Syria has no motivation to use the gas. They don't have the gas. And if they supposedly had stashed away some of the gas secretly, you would think that they wouldn't expose that fact by using it on a random small town and would have kept it in the case that there's an invasion or something to save their lives. But we're supposed to, pause, abandon reality here and accept this false logic and just believe this without any sort of thinking. And if you try to think, they'll just push the photographs of dead babies in front of you to push for an emotional response. And it doesn't matter who are the people who actually killed these kids. It doesn't matter how much evidence we have, because if you try to get any logical argument into it, they'll call you inhuman and as if you don't care about children. But it's the rebels, it's the terrorists, it's the deep state who have been killing kids for the last 15, 20 years across the entire Middle East and the globe that don't care about children.
As Madeleine Albright, when she was asked if the sanctions against Iraq were worth the death of 500,000 children, she didn't say, we didn't kill 500,000 children. She said, no, it was worth it.
I think
she had no problem with it. And as you pointed out, Leanne, talking about the children dying, the babies that we were told is why we had to get in the first Iraq war. That was a totally created script. It was totally false. And that's why I said, we now have the Trump administration sounding like Jeb and Hillary. This is so obvious to everyone, I think, who has paid any attention to it. It's just beyond belief that the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, would go there, would do inspections, would say that they have removed their weapons, would have an inspection 4 years ago. As we were able to delay this immediately when it happened, we were told we have to go right away. We have to go right. And that's the push. They want to make sure that this is going to happen immediately, because if people take the time and start to look at the evidence, as we did 4 years ago, you find out that the narrative that were sold immediately after the event is not really what happened.
Exactly.
And the longer we can stall this, the better the chance that we can get the truth out there, talking to people like you, Syrian Girl, and just going back and looking at the evidence that we've seen in the past. Your final comments here about where you would like to see this happen and what you think is the best way to push against this, and where we can get more information from you as you discover what's going on there.
Well, the heartening thing is to see InfoWars and basically all of the people who were against war not follow Trump blindly just because they voted for him. It's good to see that people are standing up for what they voted for, which is an end to regime change and an end to these wars and an end to the funding of terrorists. And the sad thing is, these white helmets, they just a few days ago, when the US struck a mosque, which was an Al-Qaeda meeting spot inside Syria, it was the white helmets that were helping Al-Qaeda dig up Al-Qaeda from under the rubble. And those white helmets called Trump a war criminal. So it's interesting that he now believes these terrorists. He now is giving them his ear, and he's supposedly the one who's against terrorists. The US is already inside Syria. They've already invaded the north of Syria. It's under the pretext of fighting ISIS, but the deep state doesn't care about that, and it's still the case. Their objective is balkanization, and to get that balkanization, they might have to end up causing World War III. And how do we stop that? It would be great to show Trump that his constituents will not stand for this. How? I'm not sure. Maybe it's going to take going onto the street and protesting. Maybe it's going to take calling up congressmen. But the frightening thing is it doesn't even seem like they're willing to speak to Congress about this or do anything in a remotely legal way, because they're even talking about bypassing the United Nations. But I hope that we can all stand up against world war.
Well, I think people have to, as you point out, we have to stand up as we did 4 years ago. And we have to stand not only, we're not really standing against Trump, we're standing with him. These people who are pushing regime change in Syria, people like John McCain, who went to Syria, the beginning of the Trump administration, he went on his own. He conducting his own foreign policy, meeting with ISIS in Syria. And he said, these people don't know anything about it. I've met with ISIS many times. He even talks about that. Yeah. So here's this guy who is pushing for regime change in Syria, working with ISIS. He is doing the same thing here, pushing this phony Russian narrative. And if we don't push back against the deep state that wants to have this continuous war here in America, they will do regime change here. They will do regime change against Donald Trump.
Right. And
they're already isolating him and taking over in terms of the only advisors that he hears from are these people. Thank you so much, Syrian Girl. And people can find you on Twitter at Partisan Girl. And do you have any other social media contacts or websites that you want to give out?
Syriangirlpartisan. Syriangirlpartisan is my YouTube, and Partisan Girl is my Facebook. Thank you so much for having me on. And I do agree that at the end they're going to take out Trump because he's made too many statements that they can't live with.
That's right. That's right. They're working on regime change or regime neutralization here in America. Thank you so much, Syrian Girl.